So welcome, sense making with open-ended text. I'm going to go through the agenda. First of all, the context for what we mean by open-ended text. Then I'm going to come back to this issue about finding stories, utilizing a frameworks approach. Then I want to highlight some of the issues, and one of those issues that I'm going to be looking at is the difference between linked and independent text, because it changes the choices you will make in how you will do your story finding. Then I'm going to look at some of the methods of analyzing qualitative information. And then I'm going to do a very quick review of computer-aided qualitative data analysis. This is a really fast-growing field, lots and lots of new tools. I would very much recommend that you, if you've not experimented with any of them, that you choose one and you experiment with it. And then I'm going to leave a few top tips with you at the end. So as I mentioned earlier, this is the third of 4 webinars this year looking at the topic of finding the story in the data. We've had 2 sessions on quantitative information. This one is about essentially qualitative information, and the final one in November will be how to use the think, feel, do paradigm to create presentations that change behavior. So what do I mean by open-ended text? Probably the largest collection of open-ended text that market researchers deal with are the verbatims in surveys. We'll ask a question like, which of these brands do you drink most often? At the bottom, there'll be other, please type in. That other type in is an open end. We might have, what did you most like about this advertising? What did you least like about this advertising? And again, people will type something in, and that is open-ended text, the survey verbatims. But also, we get text from online discussions and groups that you did not moderate. Now, I make this distinction. So if somebody has done a focus group and you have been sent the transcript, you are working with text. If you moderated that focus group, you really should have more than just the transcripts. You will have your own journal entries, you'll have your own memory of what happened in that session. So that is not just working with text. And I want to make that distinction today. Social media and blog posts generate text that we work with. Letters, people do still write letters. Lots and lots of customer satisfaction have little write-in sections. Companies get emails from customers and complaints. All of that is open-ended text and can be analyzed in useful ways. So what are we not covering today? We're not covering images and video and other artifacts, collections of objects and so on. We're not covering speech, face or body language, or how you would process your own notes or journals. This is really text from other people that has reached you in the form of text. And I mentioned before the frameworks approach, so I'm just going to run through this quickly. We've got webinars on the frameworks approach, so if you want to know more about it, please go and look back at those through our Play Again pages. The first part of the framework is to define and frame the problem. Establish what is already known and what is believed expected. One of the reasons we do this is that there are simply too many possible interpretations of the data. Now we're getting much larger data sets. We can't find every story that's in the data. So we need to look at what people think is going to happen as one of the indicators of where we will search in the data. We're going to try to prove people right, and we're going to try equally hard to prove them wrong. It's going to be one of the tools we use to find the location of the story. We need to organize the data so that we can analyze it, apply systematic analysis processes, and then extract and create the story. Now, I run some all-day workshops, and when we do, we start to use a slightly more complicated version of this form. Who is the project for? What's the business issue? Those are very standard things. What does the business want to do once it has addressed this issue? That question is often not asked clearly enough. Then a section for what do we already know? What other studies have we done? What other resources can we draw on? And then we have the assumptions and predictions. So maybe we're doing a concept test. Which concept do you think is going to win? Why do you think it's going to win? Who do you think it's going to do especially well with? And then we will look in the analysis to see whether that was correct or not. And of course, if we're not correct in these initial assumptions, we've learned something really powerful for making predictions in the future. Define the problem. Now, I've borrowed this phrase from David Smith and Jonathan Fletcher's book, and it's a really good one. A problem defined is a problem half solved. We don't spend enough time defining the problem, so we often don't know whether we found the answer or not. You need to talk to the client, ideally including the end client, not necessarily just the person who's commissioned the research, but somebody who's going to use it to make decisions and to take actions. What is the background to the research? Why is it happening now? Why didn't it happen last year? Why doesn't it happen next year? What does success look like to the people who are going to implement the decisions? What actions depend on these findings? What do people believe and what do they expect the results to be? All of this is part of defining the problem. And of course, I'm saying here it should happen before you do the text analysis. It should happen before you design the research. Now, that will not always be your choice. But if you've been given the text and told to analyze it, then you still go back and define the problem, create the framework. But ideally, create it before the research is even designed. We're going to use the business question as a lens to look at the data. As I said, there are too many stories in the data. So we have to have something that helps us look in exactly the right place. Insights need to link to outcomes and they need to link to action. So what is happening? Why is it happening? And then we want to say, what changes can I make? And what changes can I encourage others to make? These are the key elements that we're going to apply the business question as a lens to identify. So all of that in many ways is a preamble to the open-ended text. It applies equally to quantitative information. It applies equally to groups that we've moderated. But now let's focus on the text part. And I want to think about two dimensions, quantity of text and complexity. And for complexity, we could also mean depth, we could mean richness. So at the simple, we might have in our everyday life a shopping list. Here are 10 items we're going to buy from the supermarket. Or we may have done a survey with 1,000 people and we've got a really good brand list saying which of these brands do you buy, but at the bottom we've got brand other, please type in, and 10 people have typed in something there. Now these are really simple lists, we just read them. Now we have something only slightly more complicated. We've done a survey with 1,000 people and we've asked an open-ended question. What is your favorite brand of soft drink? Now there's a little bit of complexity in there because somebody might have put in caffeine-free Diet Coke and somebody else may have put in Coke. Somebody else may have put in Diet Coke. So we've got some variations in the name and we've got to decide how we're going to group them together. But it's a pretty straightforward job. We've got quite a lot of information, but it's relatively simple. Now let's think about something more complex, a poem. People do a whole PhD on analyzing a single poem. Sometimes poems are discussed for decades or centuries after they're written. If we have a lover's letter, we're looking at it, wondering exactly what is meant. Similarly, although much less prosaically, if we've got an in-depth interview with a dentist, we are going to be reading that in depth. And we can do that in depth because we don't normally have very many of them. We're not going to read a lot of poems and do the analysis. We're not going to have a lot of lovers' letters, I would imagine. And when we do IDIs, if we're going to do proper analysis, we don't collect too many of them. We will have 10 or 15 or 20. But because of the way the world is changing, because of social media, because of online surveys, because of the ability to make social media comments and blog posts, we are finding we have more and more text that is complex. So maybe we've got 100 pages of user feedback, or hundreds of online discussions. Each online discussion may have 20 people making 10 or 15 comments each. We might have thousands of complaint letters, and we want to really pick the essence out of what's going on there. We want to do sense making with those complaint letters. Or we may have millions of posts about Apple. Now we have to adopt a different strategy. So sense making depends on where we are on this spectrum. The more we are to the left in terms of quantity, the more we will just read it. The higher we are in terms of complexity, the more we have to bring analysis into that process. There's another important consideration, and this is one that flies in the face of some of the automation techniques that I'll be talking about later. Is the text standalone or linked? And I'm going to look at these four in sequence. So let's look at the first one. Prompted and individual. This is the easiest form of open-ended text to work with in many ways. So this is from the GRIT survey from the beginning of this year. And this particular question was, what are the most important factors to consider for the future of sampling? And what is useful to us, what makes life easier from an analysis point of view, is everybody is responding to this single question. So the context for every answer is the same. And nobody knew what other people had written. So every answer is individual. So I can look at these one at a time. I can add up how many people have talked about accuracy, how many people were positive, how many people were negative about the future, how many people talked about representativity. All of those things make sense because it's prompted and individual. So that is a really straightforward case. Unprompted and individual. So around social media in lots of places, people are posting a comment. It's just them. It's not in response to anybody else. And I can use that for analysis. But now I need to be much more careful. I have to work out what is the context. Why are they saying that in this place? What is the agenda? How much of the text do I want to use? And I can't simply add these numbers up in quite the same way. I can think about how loudly the topic is being talked about. That is certainly interesting because of the unprompted nature. The next category I want to talk about is linked within one person. So here we have, again from the GRIT survey, one of the questions in the GRIT survey, for those of you who remember it from earlier in the year, was which agency is most innovative? People had picked, I think, 8 or 9 agencies, and then they had to say which one was the most innovative. And then they were asked a question, why do you say that? So somebody said Lucid, and then they typed in ability to leverage platform to connect buyers and sellers. So we can see it's a techie sort of reason. Then somebody typed in System 1, formerly Brain Space Juicer. Now, we need to be careful with text because, of course, the real spelling of Brain Juicer doesn't have a space, but that is one of the interesting things about open-ended text. And they send out a lot of information about what they're doing with webinars and case studies. Then Sawtooth, which is cutting-edge technology and knowledge of a specialized field. And then Happy Thinking people, who are a qualitative agency, screening and integrating. And why do you say that? Is linked to the brand they mentioned. There will be some elements where we could go down the why did you say that and say that the family and the vocabulary that people use when describing innovative companies is this. But actually, we probably want to group together the techie agencies and say, this is what makes them innovative. Then we want to think about the new thinking agencies and say, this is what makes them innovative. Then we want to think about the specialists, the ones using advanced techniques, and say, this is what makes them. So this data is linked within one person. And we can make a mistake if we just analyze that by columns. But here is the most complex of the situations. So we have a bit of a dialogue going on here. John, I think Saucony are the best running shoe at the moment. Sally, me too. Pete, yes, every time. They are nice, but I think they're too expensive, says Adele. John comes back. I think they're worth it. They feel more comfortable and sportive. Don't even have to break them in. Sally, yes, definitely worth it. Now let's think about analyzing that. We've got 4 people discussing running shoes. What we can see as humans is that all 4 think that the Saucony is quite a good shoe, but one person thinks they're too expensive. As humans, we have no difficulty recognizing that me too is a reference to Saucony. And yes, every time is a reference to Saucony. But if we break that into an analysis program, and we might find that, okay, how many mentions of Saucony are there in this text? It looks like 1. Maybe if the software is slightly clever, it'll say, well, John talked twice, so maybe that's 2 mentions. In fact, we've got 4 people talking about it. For humans, no problem. But if we break that data into separate pieces, we're going to lose a lot of the connection to the topic under discussion. So we need to think more carefully when we move away from the human analysis, or we need to come back to the human analysis if we start to do some technical analysis. Now, here's a fairly strong assertion. If you can use TripAdvisor to see whether or not a place is worth visiting, you can do qualitative analysis. So this is what I call my TripAdvisor paradigm. So I was looking at TripAdvisor and I saw this review. Rude staff, had to wait at check-in. Members of staff passed us, never acknowledged us, so made to wait. And I'm thinking about, should I stay in that hotel? I don't automatically decide I'm not going to stop in that hotel because I want to see whether or not I believe this person. And even if I believe them, are they talking about the things that I would be worried about? So rude staff made to wait for quite a long time, just walking past us. We were not acknowledged, not apologized to. Rooms are nice. Oh, that's good. Breakfast is okay. Small plate, so you have to go up a few times. Well, maybe I don't want quite as big a breakfast as he wants. Checkout was just as bad. So, okay, we've got an issue about the checking, the checking out. Looks like the rooms are good. Looks like the breakfast is probably fine for me. And then we've got a couple of other things down there. Now, what would I do if I tried to work out more about this person's review? Well, I would look at some other places this person reviewed. So now here are 3 more places this person reviewed, and I can see that sometimes they give good scores and sometimes they give bad scores. That's encouraging. If I found somebody that always gave good scores, I'd be less interested. If they always gave bad scores, I'd be less interested. And I can see a little bit what's going on. And on the top one, brilliant place for kids, great to have fun with kids. Now, I am really interested in knowing what business people think about this particular hotel. I would also do some triangulation to see if there are places which this person has visited that I have visited, because then I could see how the descriptions compared. All of those processes are relatively complex qualitative analysis processes that we do day in and day out. And the more we use review sites like TripAdvisor, the more we're actually using qualitative techniques. And it's a small step to go from our everyday skills to add some formal skills to make them more effective in sense making. So the TripAdvisor paradigm. What are the themes, the elements, and the concepts? So this person is talking about rooms, he's talking about the check-in process, about the breakfast process. Why have they written it? Every time you read a piece of text that somebody has written, you really need to ask yourself, why have they written it? What is their agenda? What sort of person are they? Are they basically positive, basically negative? Are they a family person? Are they a business person? Are they somebody who switches from being really happy to being really angry? Or are they somebody who has lots of shades of grey? What were their expectations? I remember reading a TripAdvisor session about somebody who had gone to a hotel in Malta that I was thinking of going to. And they were it was a 3-star hotel, and they were really criticizing it for not having 5-star facilities. They said the room's clean, the people are friendly, the food's great, but it doesn't have a pool, it doesn't have this, it doesn't have that. I thought, right, okay, their expectations are wrong, but I quite like the sound of this hotel. What role are they performing? We all perform roles in life. If we're a teacher, when we're in front of the class, we perform the role of a teacher. We then go on a training course and we perform the role of the student. We go home and perform the role of a parent. We go out with our mates on Friday night and we perform the role of out with our mates on a Friday night. So we need to know, or we need to make an opinion and an analysis of what role people are performing. And then what elements can I triangulate? Can I ask them questions that I know the answer to? Because then I can see what their perspective is and how that compares with my perspective. Because when I say I know the answer, I don't. I have my perspective, and I can contrast my perspective with their perspective to see if it works. We're always looking for the strong feelings, beliefs, and comments. There is a certain amount of what we could perhaps call mouth music. There are things that people always say, and you really are not too interested in those. What you're interested in is where are the strong feelings, where are the beliefs, where are the real comments that are coming from the gut or the heart. I'm very, very quickly going to highlight some of the issues around academic. These slides are mostly so you can refer back to them later. There is a lot of overlap between the types of techniques that commercial market researchers use and academics, but there are also some really important differences. So timelines. In the commercial world, we're normally looking at 1 day to 1 week. Academic qualitative research can often be months or years. If you're doing a PhD, then you'll spend a year writing up the design for it, maybe a year collecting the information, and 1 or 2 years writing it up. So very, very different depth is able to be used. Success is different. In commercial, we want a better business decision. We do market research so companies can make better business decisions. Academic research is usually about advancing the body of knowledge. Purity of methodology. Academics tend to be more pure. Commercial is more pragmatic, which often means using hybrids of techniques. However, I was at a conference recently which was mostly academic, and pragmatic is no longer a dirty word to most academics. People are saying things like the ontological wars are over, let's adopt a more pragmatic approach. And I found that very reassuring. So here are some of the techniques. Grounded theory, which takes way too long for most commercial research and builds upwards. Abductive analysis, where we compare the data with theories, and we're looking for non-expected so that we can take a leap, an abduction from those to a new theory. Content analysis, this is really popular with traditional and modern research, and it tends to look at how often things are said and what are the combinations. And when you see references later to n-grams, these are the sorts of things that they're doing. Narrative analysis is much more on the entire text. So if grounded theory starts at the bottom and builds up, narrative looks at basically what are people telling me, what is the story, looking to verify alternatives. Conversation analysis is a very, very detailed look at how people make meaning. What are they doing during the discussions? And then we can have a thematic analysis. Again, it's generating themes from the data, patterns and so on, very appropriate for a lot of the computerized techniques. Another one you should be aware of, you need to go on courses and read some books if you want to be good at it, would be semiotics, where we try to take the signifier and the signified. So the word rose signifies the plant rose, but the word rose also signifies passion. And the plant rose signifies passion, which is why we give red roses. So we're looking for those connections. We're looking for different ways to understand the information. The most structurally important thing, if you're trying to find a story in the data, is you should create an overarching structure. You don't want to get a shopping list of interesting facts. This is true with quantitative analysis. You don't want a shopping list of this was significant, this was significant, this was significant. And in qualitative, you don't want a list of, oh, this was an interesting insight, this was an interesting comment, this here was fascinating. You need a structure. So here is a structure I've adapted from somebody else's work. No uniform and no books. Build together to make lack of school materials. School fees and travel costs build together to make unable to pay the school costs. Together they structure to can't afford school. At the bottom we have a set of things which build together to physically and emotionally stressed. End up with this overall picture. These children have tangible problems. So we need to build an overall story. Now we can turn that structure into a story in a very straightforward way, and our story will be honest. It won't be glossing over any details. So that is why we try to put a structure together. I'm just going to show you a couple of examples from an in-depth interview with a dentist about how we got the analysis and the sorts of things that we can do when we're looking at that open-ended text. So from conversation analysis, we look for things called pauses and repairs. So what did we ... we? Bit further down, we talked to some people ... people. Now that means that people are generally not confident. If you're talking to Americans, if you're talking to Australians, if you're talking to British people and you see that pattern, then it conveys a lack of confidence. So we're thinking that that is important. And we sort of, another phrase, that conveys lack of confidence. We've also got something quite interesting in terms of doing the next depth interview, a restructured answer. So we ask a question down there at the bottom end of the page. So in terms of materials, either preventative materials or restorative materials, what do you take into account when you decide which one to adopt? Well, that's a good question. I don't know. I suppose we laughs, look at reliability. Now, what that means is this is a bad question. That is not a method of thinking about the situation that makes sense to this dentist. So next time we do a depth interview, and with any luck, this might be the first of 10, we would revisit that question, because where it looks like we're painting somebody into a corner and they have to do a bit of restructuring to get out of that situation. We can also look at footings. This is the role that somebody plays in a conversation. And here we can see we sort of, because I don't really trust comments like that, we're getting more of a picture that this is somebody who is not very confident, but also who is doubtful about the sources available to them. So they know they don't know very much about it themselves, but actually they don't trust the providers. Repetition. Now, one of the things that's interesting is if you look at the question, what do you take into account when you decided to buy this new technology? What we did, we looked at cost. And I saw an analysis of this IDA that said cost is the first thing they mentioned. It is, and they never repeat it, even in more of the text when you look at it. It's kind of a sense thing. I have to say cost. If somebody asks me what do I consider, I say cost. If I never say it again, it's probably not that important to me. But we see that reliability is repeated in the text. And we also see that internet sites, this is where this person goes to for information. There's a couple of internet sites here. I'm finding the internet. So we're starting to see which things they're actually talking more about. Evaluative terms. Where do people actually put a little bit of their heart, soul, gut into it? So I quite like my own little research. I don't really trust the research that comes with the product. Actually quite good for new products. So these are the sorts of places where we're seeing the warm text. So we can pull that together then. Okay, this dentist lacks confidence. He or she mentions cost, but comes back to the topic of reliability. He or she distrusts the research from the manufacturers, so tries to do his or her own research by connecting with people who have used these new products already, and he tends to do that, or she tends to do that via internet forums. So what would we recommend from that? Connect this type of dentist with happy users. You want to get comments from happy users, and you really want to get your happy users posting reliability testimonials and social media posts, because if this dentist can find them without coming to you, that will be even better. So that is an example of how we work our way through that sort of information. There are some common analytical elements that are useful to know about. The first of those is saturated analysis, which very crudely means keep going until you stop finding new or useful things. So maybe you've got 100 interviews that have been written up. You will probably find after 10 or 20, you have found almost all the elements that are going to come up. This is particularly true if you don't take them in any preordained sequence. If you take all the men first and then the women, yes, you'll find things later on. If you take young people followed by older people, or if you take the ones from the USA before you take the ones from the UK, then it doesn't work so well. But if you've got a good randomized sampling or a purposeful sampling that I will talk about later, then saturated analysis is a good method of knowing, yeah, I've gone far enough with that. I'm not finding new information. I'm happy with the story. Structure. You need to find, or actually, if we're thinking about the epistemological position of qualitative, you need to create an architecture that describes what you find. And you should make notes of what you find when you find it. One of the great things about one of the tools I'm going to show you in a moment, NVivo, is it really encourages you to make those sorts of notes and links back so you can find all of those pieces when you come to craft the story at the end. And you want to look to support and break the hypotheses. Remember, we're looking to use the business lens to create the right story. So we're looking to support what people believe is true, and we're looking to disprove what people believe is true. Now, I mentioned computers a couple of times, and they're really important. When I started in research back in the 70s, the technology we used was scissors and colored pens. You'd photocopy the transcripts 4 times, and you'd cut them all up, and you'd use different colored pens. And it was, it sounds like it was more fun than it was. Now we tend to use things like Word and Excel for those tasks. But there's also computer-aided qualitative data analysis software. I'm going to show you some examples of that in a moment. Text analytics, starting with word clouds through to tools like Leximancer. I'm going to show you something from that in a moment. Social media analysis, the brand watchers, the Radians, and so on. Coding software, which makes the coding process easier, things like a scribe. And a growing number of things that work with photos and videos, so Google Photos, Living Lens, and so on. Ideally, if you work in a company that has a framework, you will have a set group of tools that you use in a particular way. Because one of the things you want to be able to do is you want to be able to access the materials that went into the analysis of other people's projects, and you want to be able to access the analysis they did so that you keep building a bigger and bigger corpus of knowledge in your organization. So here is a technique that I picked up many, many years ago when I was working with the research business. So I'd like to thank people like Wendy Gordon and Colleen Ryan and Rebecca Weinberg and lots of other people for holistic coding. Holistic coding means you look at everything somebody said. So even if they've done a survey, let's look at everything they said. And you can put this together really easily using Visual Basic for applications of VBA, which is what I do for these sort of cases. So this is the grit study again. And I've set it up so that it's going to show me the country, which is a closed question, whether they're client or supplier. It's going to tell me the number of employees. Then it's going to show me which brand they said was the most innovative and why they said it. So they said irrational agency, cutting edge science. Will sampling become better, worse, or stay the same? This person said better, closed question. Why do you say that? Linked, open-ended question. Because people are increasingly aware of the problems of sample quality today. Most important factor of the future of sampling, reaching people who are not typical survey takers. So I then add my comments in. This is a box here, and before I move on to the next person, I put, okay, this is a kind of a sciencey person, they're an optimistic person, and they see an expansion of the domain of market research. That makes sense from the irrational agency, who are bringing things like behavioral economics. We can see they think sampling is going to be bigger, and they're interested in getting new types of people into the industry. So we can see something holistic about their responses. Next person we go through, from the Netherlands, supplier 11 to 20, Google consumer surveys, companies great capacity. I think sampling is going to be worse because of fraudulent behavior of respondents. Most important, sampling source in a transparent way. So I'm going to code that with they're a technology person, but they're basically pessimistic. And a key factor with these people is transparency. And I will go through and I will code quite a lot of the information. But there's something like 2,500 people in there. So I'll start with a randomized order of the participants. And then after I've got a bit of a feeling for the data, I might look at everybody who said that Brain Juicer was innovative. Then I might look at everybody who said Google Consumer Surveys was innovative. I might sort by country. So let's look at the Dutch data. Let's look at the Australian data. And then I might sort by whether the samples are getting better or worse. So I keep looking at different pieces of the data, and I may not, in fact I certainly wouldn't, if all I had to do was get an overall opinion, look at 2,500 responses. I might look at 300, 400, and I will have systematically gone through in different ways to look at different aspects of the information. So I'm going to talk about one or two techniques, and a big thank you to NVivo, Mass Cognition, and Leximancer for test versions of the software. And if you go to the NVivo website, they've got this wonderful diagram which explains the basic process, not just for their software, but for really anybody's. Import it. Yeah, you've got to bring this stuff together first. Explore, code, query, reflect, visualize, memo. And that is all part of putting the structure together to build the story. This is the things I'm going to show you now are really from the starter version, which is what you use if you use a Mac, which is what I've got. There's also a Windows Pro and a Windows Plus version, which I've not used, but which have got considerably more facilities. So the sort of things that I can do, I'm going to take that grit data again, and I've taken the question, the most important factor for future of sampling, and it's looked at a simple word cloud. Well, it's not completely simple because it's stemmed the words. What do I mean by that? Well, the most common word in that text was quality. It came up 154 times. The next most common word was surveys, but actually survey, surveyed, surveying, and surveys has been automatically grouped together. If you use the advanced versions, the Windows Pro and Plus, then it will take synonyms as well, and it will take extensions and generalizations. So when we look at grouping words together, we want to make sure that if possible, we can stem those words. And ideally, we want to be able to either manually or automatically bring them together. So you're going to see a piece of work in a moment, and I can see that I've got participants and respondents. Actually, I would probably force those two together in the context of this study because it's different language that different people use to talk about the same thing. So we can do this sort of thing. We can then look at that as a word cloud. Now, I'm not a fan of a word cloud, but if you are going to use them, then you want to be using ones that allow you to have stop words. So it takes out don't, but, the, and all of those words, and allows you to deep dive. Now, by deep dive, I mean I could double click on the word bots, and it will take me through to where the text is. Rise of bots, decline of real people, more bots. We're getting automated. Bot responses in our sampling. There are a lot of bots, so I can start to look at what's going on there. And ideally, that will then take me to tools like this, which say, okay, let's look at the structure. Now, the reason I chose bots is, if I go back here, it actually it's not on, on that screen. It only comes up about 35, 40 times. If I pick a word that comes up 170 times, the word tree is just too clouded. So I am going to have to drill in and read and do analysis. So this is going to help me look at some of the overall structure, but I'm still going to have to read the information if I want to make sense of it. I'm going to have to do what I call real coding. So here is an example of some Japanese text that I took, and I've done this for a couple of reasons, because I wanted to talk about languages, and also when we're coding other people's text, we should always treat it as if it's a foreign language. Other people write differently to us. Most of you listening to this webinar will be graduates. Most of you will have done some further training in analytical thinking. The way you write is going to be different to the way that the customers of many of your clients write. So treating it as a foreign language is a good idea. The other thing I want to mention about foreign languages is that most of these tools work really well with French and German and things like that. But when you get languages like Thai and Mandarin and here Japanese that don't have spaces between the words, a lot of the automated aspects, the word clouds, the word counts, become problematic. But I can still code here. And this is what I mean by real coding. I've taken a piece of text there that talks about it was cloudy all day, but it didn't rain, and the temperature was 22 degrees centigrade. Now in the UK, that's great, and it was warmer than yesterday. So I'm going to code this as good weather, and I've got a description of what I mean by good weather. I'm going to go through this text, and I will build up a structure. And after I've done a bit of coding, I can see that, okay, I've got two aspects of weather, good weather and bad weather. They link back to weather. I've got exercise, which I'm breaking into competition. So this is actually my diary, so race days and events. And training days. There's a lot about family and there's a lot about food. I can use color coding, and then we can go into that. Now, if you use these sorts of tools, you are going to read all of the text more than once. You read it once to code it. And then you start looking at your codes and diving back into the data to say, now, what is in common? Should I break these codes up? What overlap is there? Most of you probably can't read that at the moment, but there is a whole bunch of stuff in there which relates to food and brothers. So we've got family and food together, and we've got food and sports together. So the software will let me look at the overlaps between those and go to the text to get a deeper set of meanings and to find the example text that I want to be able to use to tell my story. So there is a lot more. Search you can do with synonyms and specializations. There's end capture, which will bring in social media data for you, some automated coding, including sentiment analysis. So please visit them for more information. Leximancer, I wanted to show this because it's another paradigm, it's another concept, another way of looking at it. It starts with the automated option. So really, if we're looking at it with NVivo, we would start in a very manual way most of the time, although it does have some tools, build something up, and then we can use the tools to make it easier. Here we're going to start with a more automated way. It looks at words in context and creates concepts, which we can then drill down. So again, taking that future of sampling data from the GRIT survey, I said, okay, what do you think the structure is? And Leximancer came back to me from the open-ended text and said, looks to us like there are three basic concepts with an area of overlap. There's respondents, there's surveys, and there's the sample process. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I can break that down into smaller groups. So actually mobile is an issue in its own right. Participation is an area, quality is an area, representativity, and access. So all of these are now looking at concepts. So if I wanted to think about doing saturated sampling, I would take text from all of these circles until I reached a saturated sampling point of view to know that I had got deep enough into the information. So we can look at how many comments are talking about sample and representative and respondents. Then we can deep dive into that. And again, just like my holistic coding, it shows me, okay, this comment here is from the United Kingdom. It's from a supplier from Europe, 11 to 20. What are the most important factors? Confidence the sample is accurate. I am still reading. None of the automated analytical techniques will do away with you as the sense maker doing the reading. They will help you find the location of the sense. They can make you more efficient at recording your information. They can help you put a structure to it, but it's mostly about you. The final example is from Mass Cognition, new company in this area. And we're going to look at a couple of things. One is an n-gram. An n-gram is a combination of words. So in the supplier's answers to this future of sampling question, the most common bigram, that's 2 words separated by a space, was representative sample. That's quite interesting. And quality of sample was pretty much equal to it. And we can compare that with clients, because if you remember what I was saying on previous webinars, the way to find the story is you find the big story, the story that's true for most people, and then you find the relevant exceptions. So if we see there are no differences between clients and suppliers, that's great. It means that the big truth is true. But sometimes there are subtle differences. And here's one. Professional respondent is mentioned quite a lot by clients, much less by suppliers, because suppliers know it's not, in most cases, a real problem. Most professional, there have been quite a few studies into this, most professional respondents, i.e. people who do it for the money, give truthful answers, they are very representative, they work hard, they're actually a real asset. What clients often think of as professional respondents are people who are giving the wrong answers in order to earn the money. So we have a bit of a gap there that we might want to try to close down. But we've got an interesting one here. Up in terms of things that need fixing, the suppliers say we've got to stop clients asking for really long surveys. And clients don't mention the need to stop clients having long surveys as one of the most mentioned things in the future. So we can see some of those things that come out of the data now as an interesting part of the story, that if the endpoint, remember what the business decision for looking at the future of sampling is probably something to do with how do we improve sampling? How do we make sure that our business stays intact? One of the ways we need to do it is to get the client side more interested in the length of survey. So we need to find some way of connecting to that. Triangulation. So this is where we're trying to find things that we know are true from somewhere else in our text data. Because if we can find something in the text data that we can validate elsewhere, we can become more confident in the text data. So the suppliers have got, in terms of their adjectives, mobile as the most important word. It drops to second in the clients list. Doesn't sound like a big difference, except it is a really distant second. So it's gone from stand out first to really distant second. And we know from other data that suppliers are much more involved in the need to go mobile because they have to deliver it. Clients want good research conducted with the right people, but they don't think too hard. They don't have to think too hard about the technicalities of making it mobile. They know they want it to be mobile. Suppliers have to make mobile happen. So it's more important for them. So when suppliers are talking about the benefits of their system, it's not so beneficial to keep talking about mobile. They talk about it because it's really hard and they've done great stuff to make it possible, but it's not as salient as they think it would be. So coming back to this field of play, what do we do with it? Well, if it's in the bottom left, there's not much text and it's not very complex, we just read it. If it's a small amount of text and it's really complex, then we read and analyze it, and we use proper analytical techniques, and we become qualitative researchers, or we utilize qualitative researchers to do that. If we've got large amounts of simple text, we're going to use software. A little bit of oversight, bit of sense checking, but really we're going to turn those codings into straightforward mentions. We might do some sentiment analysis. If all we're interested in is whether people are positive or negative, yeah, we're down there in that zone. But up here, we've got two options. We're going to take a sample of the data, we're going to read it and analyze it, or we're going to use the computer-aided techniques, and then we're going to read a lot of information and we're going to analyze it. There isn't an option that drops read and analyze. How you get to read and analyze changes, but if you want to do good sense making with text, you're going to have to do read and analyze as part of that process. So finding the story, we're going to use the client's question as the lens. Tag, code, memo the material as you analyze it. Challenge what is known and believed. Find the main story, then you find those relevant exceptions. So, there's an interesting difference about mobile between clients and suppliers. There is an interesting difference, and I've looked at that data with Mass Cognition and Andrew, between Europe and the USA, and the use of the word quality is very different in the European data than in the USA data. So that has some implications for how you would do your messaging. Create an overall structure, which is going to be the plot of the story. It's the main storyline that's going to carry through the deliverable. And then work out whether you've got good news or bad news. Now, I've got some separate webinars on that issue, but you should always know, am I delivering good news to my client, or am I delivering bad news? Because the way you tell the story and the amount of time you ask and the amount of back checking you will have to provide varies immensely depending on good news. Short meeting, not much back checking. Bad news, long meeting, probably several meetings, and they're going to want to back check all the details. So the top tips: define the problem before starting. Understand what qualitative analysis is. Think about the paradigm of understanding TripAdvisor. Use the business question as a lens to find the main story and the relevant exceptions. Create the story with a clear architecture. Learn how to use at least one computer-aided tool between now and the end of the year. Thank you. I hope you found that useful, and I look forward to questions.